Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Jerry, for allowing this refugee briefing to take place during your regular monthly call. And thank you, Brittany, for that overview of U.S. immigration policy. So we'll turn now to the first program in the Philanthropy in the Global Refugee Crisis webinar series. And I'm really delighted to welcome all of you on behalf of grant makers concerned with immigrants and refugees. And we have 11 co-sponsoring organizations that are listed in the next slide here. Oops, there we go. In particular, we have a number of regional associations of grant makers and colleague foundation and affinity groups, especially the International Human Rights Funders Group that Jerry mentioned earlier, with whom we anticipate working very closely on this issue. I want to quickly as well thank my colleagues on the GSER team, Caleb, Michael, Kreese, and Camelia, who worked hard to help make this webinar happen, and also Taryn Hagashi of Unbound and Suzette Brooks-Masters of J.M. Kaplan Foundation, who've been really wonderful advisors for this program. The refugee crisis is one that has been escalating over the past several years and very global in nature. Last year, the U.S. saw tens of thousands of unaccompanied children fleeing violence in Central America, and Philanthropy responded with funding humanitarian relief, legal aid, a range of health and social services to help these children settle in communities across the U.S. And actually, many of you who responded to that crisis are among the 180 funders, regional associations, et cetera, who helped mount a response last year. This level of interest in this call, we have 180 plus registered funders on this call, really reflects the magnitude of the global crisis. There's 60 million people, or 1 out of every 120 people across the globe, that have been displaced from their homes and are either classified as refugees or internationally displaced persons. And we're going to kick this off by getting you guys involved a little bit in the webinar and take a little poll. So you see it right on your screen right now. Which 2 countries, and since it's been on here for a while, maybe you had a chance to Google it, but which 2 countries account for 43% of the world's refugee population? Option 1, Afghanistan and Syria. Number 2, Iraq and Syria. 3, Somalia and Syria. So just go ahead and submit your response, and we'll take a look at the results in a minute. Okay. So Caleb, I think I don't know if you can tell how many people have replied, and whether we could take a look at the results, or are people still pressing that button? Okay. So shall we just skip to the results? Let's see what you guys said. Okay, so the real answer actually is that Syria and Afghanistan account for 43% of the world's refugee population, 21% from Syria and 22% from Afghanistan. We'll just do one more. Which country accounts for 23% of the world's internally displaced persons? We've got 2 options here, or 4 options here rather. So click on one response, and then we'll skip quickly to the results. Okay, let's see. I'm just going to go ahead. So most of you, and I think the results are still coming in, Syria being the winner. And surprisingly, it's actually Colombia at 23%. It's a trick question because Syria is at 28%, but the point being that this is really a global crisis, and it's not just one affecting the Middle East, but really across the globe. But you are absolutely right that Syria is really the hot spot. 9.5 million Syrians, or 43% of that nation's population, have been displaced from their homes, either living as IDPs or fleeing the country as refugees. So now we're going to get to the three experts who are going to brief you on the scope, scale, and impact of this global crisis. We've got three folks teed up for you. Bill Frelick, who is Director of Refugee Program at Human Rights Watch, and he'll provide an overview of the crisis and his take on what philanthropy can do. Next will be Becca Heller, who's Director and Co-founder of the International Refugee Assistance Project. She'll take a look at the needs and gaps in the field and at the policy level and offer a pretty concrete set of funding recommendations for you all to consider. And finally, Maria Teresa Rojas, who is the Director of the International Migration Initiative at the Open Society Foundations, will share the work of the Open Society Network and what it has supported across the globe, as well as her perspective on funding strategies. So each speaker will have about 10 minutes to speak. We'll take some clarifying questions if we have time in between presentations using the chat function. And we've reserved the bulk of the last part of the webinar for discussion and questions. And we'll try to unmute everyone at that point. But earlier on we heard a lot of background noise, so it was a bit challenging to do so. So I'm going to ask Bill to come up and speak. And Caleb, his phone number, so you can unmute him, is 212-993-72. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not the right number. Hold on. It's 202-612-4344. And Bill actually has just returned from Macedonia, Greece, and Serbia, doing some field work there. So, Bill, perhaps you can start by saying a few words on what you saw on the ground and what Human Rights Watch is doing, and then turn to the overview.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I've actually lost the network connection to the webinar, but I still have the phone connection, so I can't really see anything. First, I do want to thank the grant makers concerned with immigrants and refugees and all the co-sponsors for inviting me on. I greatly appreciate it. And as you just mentioned, I am fresh back from the field. I was in Macedonia, Serbia, and Greece all last week. And I have to say that for me personally, it was just an amazing experience to be really witness close up to this, really a tide of humanity of people who are desperate on the one hand, but full of hope on the other. And to talk to them individually, to see, in one sense to see the massive numbers, but at the same time to talk to people one by one, to hear their stories, to see, what they are talking about in terms of why they're leaving their countries and what they're seeking for their futures, and to see, young fathers carrying children on their shoulders, to see people, helping and carrying each other when their feet are bleeding from having walked the great distances that they've walked. It's really just for me personally, very inspiring, and I hope in some way I can convey that to others, and just to recognize again the importance. Through looking at all these numbers, ultimately we are talking about individual human beings. We're talking about each person with their own story, their own reason for being compelled to leave their homelands, many very, very reluctantly. I talked to so many people that said, I was in Syria, I've been there for 4 years, I tried to hang on as long as I could, I did everything I could to stay, and I finally gave up. I can't do it anymore. I don't see any prospect for peace, and if not for myself, at least for my children, I have to leave now. And I think a lot of people wonder, why is it happening now? Why is it that you've got this tide, if you will, of humanity. We've seen, I mean, the statistics from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees show that of the people that have been arriving by way of Greece, either mostly by boat, 90% of them coming in this year are coming from just 5 countries. They're coming from Somalia, from Afghanistan, Eritrea, Iraq, and did I say Somalia already? Those 5 countries, which are all refugee-producing countries. 2 of them, Afghanistan and Somalia, have been failed states, protracted situations going on now for 30 years, and we're all, I think, at this point quite familiar with the situations in Iraq and Syria as well, with ISIS, of course, is the newest element there. Eritrea, a highly repressive regime that has created refugees for a very, very long time as well. This, in a broader context, the High Commissioner for Refugees talks about 60 million people of concern now. Last year at this time, they had talked about 50 million, which they were saying was unprecedented since the end of the Second World War. So just in the course of another year, the global total has gone up by another 10 million people. Let me circle back a little bit just briefly to say something about Human Rights Watch and what we do. I mean, I mentioned my own just experience of having been there last week, but what we do is particularly focus on the protection aspect. That we're not an operational NGO, we're not involved in humanitarian assistance, but as part of a larger human rights organization, my small refugee program, which is only 2 people, myself and 1 more, we coordinate with all the researchers at Human Rights Watch and work to look particularly at issues of access to asylum. And we've done this, in fact, before this current crisis, I was actually doing a lot of intense work in Mexico looking at the very question that this group has been looking at since last year, which is the unaccompanied children and others that are coming up from Central America through Mexico. And I was particularly looking at the problems that they encounter in Mexico and whether they have any chance for seeking asylum there. And I think that's indicative of what we've been looking at globally, whether it's with Australia, the European Union, the United States, Israel. We're looking at destination countries that use buffer states, if you will, that focus on the transit states, that try to block access to asylum in various ways. They may be, legal methods, they may be security buffers, but basically trying to block the path of people that are trying to lodge asylum claims. And we're also looking, of course, at the capacity of those transit countries or countries of first asylum to actually provide protection and, of course, to provide other necessary assistance to people. So, when you look at the situation in Syria in particular, which of course is the real preoccupation right now, with 4 million refugees in the immediately surrounding countries, with twice that number of internally displaced people, we're looking at a situation that's been going on since 2011. We're looking at a dwindling capacity of those countries of first asylum to provide humanitarian assistance, and donor countries that have not been able to keep up with the demand for this crisis, as well as South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, all very poorly funded. The UN appeal for the Syria crisis is at $4.5 billion, and it's only funded at 37%. 1.6 billion has been received, which means that the World Food Program and others are cutting back food rations. It means that basic humanitarian needs of this refugee population are not being met. And where we focused a lot of our attention has looked at some of the consequences of that. Consequences, for example, of children not going to school because they are put into exploitative work situations, and also of those governments now really putting on much more restrictive measures to try particularly to prevent new arrivals from coming in. The border with Jordan is virtually closed at this point to Syrian refugees. Lebanon, which has been very open, has put some very strong restrictions in as well. I mean, you look at a country like Lebanon, for all the problems that Europe has faced, with somewhere approaching maybe 430,000 new arrivals this year, that's still 1/10 of 1% of the population of the European Union. You do compare that to Lebanon, which has 1.1 million refugees there, and that's about 25% of its total population. So you see the difference between what the countries in the immediate vicinity are faced with and what those further along are dealing with. But let's look at that. I mean, let's look at how the European is dealing with this and what the response has been. Europe, before there was a crisis, had developed what was called a common European asylum system. On paper, the European Union has a harmonized system where supposedly whether an asylum seeker arrives in Bulgaria or Sweden, they would find the same reception conditions, the same procedures, the same standards, and would be treated just the same way. The reality, of course, is completely different from that. And the outcomes in asylum are that last year, 77% of asylum claims in Sweden were approved, whereas in Hungary it was less than 10%. And reception conditions, of course, in those countries in the periphery have been abysmal. Now, the real problem there is that the rule that the European Union set up is called the Dublin Rule, the Dublin Regulation, which basically says that the country of first arrival is the country responsible for examining asylum claims, for integrating refugees, ultimately for processing, every aspect of this. And looking at a map, what that essentially does is it insulates the richer countries that are on the interior of the European Union, and it puts the entire burden on the shoulders of those countries, the poorest countries of the EU with the least capacity to receive and process refugee claims, like Greece, like Bulgaria, Malta even. And so what's happened is the system that had cracks in it from the beginning has completely broken down. Those countries on the periphery have waved people through, or they've set up fences to keep them out, and both Greece and then Bulgaria and then Hungary have all built fences on their borders. And now we're seeing, instead of a common European asylum system, we see a completely fractured system. Instead of any kind of unity and coordination, with each country going on its own, we're really seeing, with some fear, a race to the bottom of each really trying to persuade asylum seekers not to come here, go somewhere else. And the impact of that is being felt predominantly in Germany, which has been the most welcoming of these countries. But that is also not a rational solution. It shouldn't be based on the happenstance of geography where a person applies for asylum. It also shouldn't be based on which country has expressed the most generosity. It should be based on some rational assessment of what's the capacity of each of these countries to assess claims and to receive people. And the European Commission has suggested a relocation plan within the EU. They came up with a very modest proposal for 40,000 places to be relocated within the Union. They couldn't even get more than 33,000 pledges for that, and that was in July, the same month that there were 50,000 new arrivals in Greece. So obviously there's a huge disconnect between what's being discussed in Brussels and the realities that are being faced on the periphery. And just,
Bill?
yes.
Oh, sorry, this is Darren. We have a couple minutes left for you, and
Okay.
I'm wondering, given the magnitude of the problem that you've described,
Sure.
what are your thoughts on how philanthropy can play a role in addressing some of the issues you've raised?
Yeah. So as I said, I mean, the donor governments are not keeping pace with the humanitarian need. That's clear. And from what I told you, the billions of dollars that are being required to meet humanitarian needs, is well beyond the capacity of private philanthropy to meet. And so I think what private philanthropists ought to be thinking about is how do you leverage government funding for humanitarian assistance, and then what do you do in the meantime to try to maintain protection, to maintain asylum space for people. And I think this really does look at what are the innovative approaches that you can be funding on the humanitarian side, and what are the best advocacy approaches that you can do in terms of looking at this as a protection issue, as a rights question. And let me parenthetically say, it's not just a rights question for refugees. There are economic migrants that are mixed into this, and they may not be in need of international protection in the same way as refugees are, but they are human beings and they have human rights as well. So we shouldn't lose track of that, and I think attention ought to be paid to them as well. I think that one of the critical and I think one of the trickiest issues is this question of capacity building in the countries of first asylum, in transit countries. And here I think the trap is twofold. One is that while everyone's in favor of capacity building, you have to ask capacity for what? And much of the narrative from the government side has been on smuggling rings and has been on essentially law enforcement. And I think one of the things to be aware of, to be thinking about, is the extent to which humanitarian rhetoric and some genuine humanitarian motives are used to mask what is essentially a law enforcement agenda. And so I think trying to think of again how philanthropic money is best used needs to bear that in mind. The second part about capacity building is the worry that as funding goes in to build capacity, that you haven't necessarily achieved capacity at that point. And the fear is that there will be a pretext for sending people back to third countries as quickly as they can possibly do. I mean, Hungary's already doing it with respect to Serbia. Quite a number of countries are wanting to do it with respect to Turkey as well. And here I think we have to look very carefully that, while it's important to provide funding to those countries that are struggling, that it isn't used as a pretext to basically say, okay, they're being funded, now everything's fine, send everyone back to those places, and you're just going to end up having these vast dumping grounds where the problem is deflected to the countries that still have the least capacity to handle the issue. So I would just say that those would be two areas that I'd be cautious of, and to think carefully about where government money is best spent and the scale of the problem in terms of government funding versus private funding, and how that private funding might be able to be used to leverage the larger amounts that governments have the capacity to provide as donor states.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. And we do have some questions from the participants for you. One is
mine's back up, so I can actually read the hi there. Curious to know.
Oh, good. Yes, excellent.
Okay.
I'm glad.
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one certainly in Greece, and I think it's ironic. So the question is, what organizations are out there? Which ones are working on the ground? First, I mean, there are local organizations. I was working very closely with a local Macedonian organization that was just created there by Macedonians themselves to show their solidarity. My colleagues in Hungary were finding the same thing. Hungarians spontaneously coming to the train station with toys and clowns and whatnot to entertain kids. I mean, it was really, really wonderful to see. So there are local groups that are really doing wonderful, wonderful work, even when their governments are not. I was impressed to see, and it was ironic to see the International Rescue Committee, operating in Greece. This is an organization, a humanitarian organization that works in the poorest countries in the world, and to see IRC on, Greek holiday islands where you think of, Scandinavians as going for their vacations, and doing, the basic water and sanitation work, and seeing makeshift camps going up is really quite remarkable. And so, there are now some of the bigger NGOs that you would least expect to see in European Union member states that are actually providing humanitarian assistance in the way that you would expect to see in places in Africa that have far less capacity. So, I mean,
Oh,
specific.
sorry. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Bill. And that question was from Marcia Quinones of the Marin Community Foundation. And Marcia also said that specific organization names of U.S.-based groups are especially helpful for their donors. And we could provide a list of groups as follow-up to the webinar as well. So I think, and Bill is going to be back to answer more of your questions. He's staying on for the whole webinar. So now we're going to quickly, it's hard to get you all to do evaluations afterwards, so we're going to do a quick evaluation of Bill's presentation now. The results will not pop up on the screen, so please go ahead and do a quick eval. And while you're doing that, I want to introduce to you Becca Heller, who's our next speaker. And Bill, thank you so much. I neglected to thank you for sharing both what you've been seeing on the ground and your depth of expertise around these issues.
Great, thank you.
Okay, great. So now we're going to turn to Becca, who's really going to, I think, build a lot on what Bill has presented, and draw on the rich and varied and vitally important work that the International Refugee Assistance Project is doing on the ground in the Middle East. So, Becca, I will turn this over to you.
Sure. Can you all hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Oh, great. So I am the director and co-founder of the International Refugee Assistance Project, which for another 3 days will still be the Iraqi Refugee Assistance Project. We've been planning for about a year to change our name, and it is odd/fortuitous/tragic that it coincided with the current refugee crisis. But we work throughout the Middle East with refugees from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and North Africa. We organize law students and lawyers around the globe to provide legal representation and counseling to more than 3,000 refugees. We have offices on the ground in several places in the Middle East, and we've done pretty extensive advocacy with both the U.S. and the UN. So that's kind of the empirical basis of my recommendations. The overall message from my presentation is that there's a bad news, good news scenario. The bad news is that there's a huge refugee crisis and it's affecting a lot of people. I think that it's actually good that this issue is coming to the forefront. I've been told for a long time that my work with Middle East refugees is a niche issue. Someone once told me that Iraq and Syria were passé. And I think the fact that it's sort of hit the shores of Europe is forcing the world to wake up and pay attention in a way that's really important. The good news is that there are concrete things that people can do. I think we all hear the numbers. We hear 60 million refugees and the UN wants $4.5 billion. And those seem like really overwhelming numbers to tackle for small NGOs or small funders or even large NGOs that are not operating on a service scale of 60 million refugees. But if you take one thing away from this, let it be that there is hope. There are concrete things that NGOs and activists and funders and governments can be doing to really improve the situation on the ground, and I think to start to make a dent both in terms of the immediate humanitarian situation, but also in terms of setting up systems that will alleviate this crisis and prevent us from getting to levels like this in the long run. And I'm going to try to be as concrete and specific as possible. And for those of you who are on the phone and can't see my PowerPoint, just imagine like the most beautiful PowerPoint you've ever seen. So first I want to talk a little bit about conditions in countries of first asylum. Bill touched on this. Your country of first asylum is the first place you go when you flee your homeland. So in the case of Syrian refugees, it's mostly Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. Oftentimes conditions in the countries of first asylum are not all that much better than they were in the place from which you fled. There's a big problem with the economic and social exclusion of refugees. Most of these countries are not signatories to the UN Convention on the Status of Refugees. Turkey is, but their implementation is mixed at best. which means that people can't work, they can't sort of participate in the market. A lot of the time children can't go to school, there's no health care. In addition to that, for a lot of the most vulnerable refugees, they're subject to ongoing persecution. So if you are a single woman at risk, or a torture survivor, or a human rights activist, and you flee Syria and you go to Lebanon, chances are you're not all that much safer there, and your persecutors can continue to pursue you. The other issues that exist are that UNHCR really kind of controls the fate of most refugees in countries of first asylum, both in terms of who can get protection, who can register, but also who gets access to foreign aid, because most of the foreign aid that gets provided is contingent on someone first being registered with the United Nations. Let me figure out how to go to the next slide. There we go. But a lot of the time the most vulnerable refugees totally lack access to the United Nations. First off, Turkey and Lebanon are no longer allowing the United Nations to register refugees at all. In Lebanon, that led to a 52% decrease in the number of refugees that even approach the United Nations. UNHCR is allowed to provide services to refugees, but only if they're flagged by some kind of outside agency. UNHCR also doesn't have the capacity to do affirmative outreach or home visits. So if you're in hiding in your home, maybe because you are a woman who was trafficked, or you can't leave your home because you have a disability or a medical issue, you don't have access to UNHCR. If you are an ostracized population that's not going to affirmatively approach UNHCR, you don't have access. In addition, UNHCR is trying to get through so many cases that oftentimes, even if someone does approach, their case doesn't get screened for services. So hypothetically, what's supposed to happen is that you approach UNHCR and they do a detailed interview with you and they say, what are your needs? Do you need to be referred to the medical unit? Do you need to be referred for protection? Do you need to be referred for resettlement? In the status quo, what happens is that people show up a lot of the time and they get a number and their name is taken down, but there isn't time to screen them, which means that nobody is actually identifying what the needs of the most vulnerable refugees are, so those needs can't get filled. There's also a self-identification problem, which is that, picture you are a gay man who has been sexually assaulted multiple times. You manage to show up to UNHCR in Ankara, and someone is taking down your name to give you a registration card. In those 15 minutes, how comfortable are you going to be volunteering the fact that you're gay and a sexual assault survivor? There's a big self-identification problem for particularly persecuted groups, and again, in this scenario, if you don't self-identify, you're not getting the services to which you should be entitled. Finally, there are multi-year wait times. People who are registering in Ankara are being given interview dates of 2020 or 2022. And when you face something like that, it starts to look like maybe your better option is to get on a boat. You flee from Syria, you get to Lebanon or Turkey, you realize that you're still in danger, you can't get any protection, you're told to come back to the UN in 7 years, and your odds start to look a little better trying to be smuggled into Europe. And the message that we're trying to get across is that nobody gets on a boat who has another option. And that a lot of the reason I think for the increase in the migration flow into Europe is the failure of systems in the countries of first asylum to appropriately identify and serve the immediate needs of refugees. And to illustrate that, I just want to tell briefly the story of one of our clients. I'm going to call him Adnan. He is gay. He was severely persecuted in a number of ways in Iraq. He initially fled to Lebanon, where he registered with UNHCR. Then he got picked up and deported back to Iraq by the Lebanese government. UNHCR wasn't able to prevent his deportation. We worked with some pretty high-level actors to get him back out of Iraq and a visa into Jordan. He again registered with the UNHCR in Jordan and was referred to the U.S. for resettlement. While he was waiting, he got picked up in a sting operation by Jordanian police that was targeting gay people. He fled across the border to Turkey. He went to register in Ankara, and he was given an interview date of 2022. And at that point, he decided that he had had enough. and he paid a smuggler to take him into Europe, and then emailed us and said, "Hi from Germany. They greeted me with flowers and chocolates. I'm going to tell all my friends that they should get smuggled also." And there are obviously a number of places in that narrative where effective intervention by an outside agency might have prevented that from happening. And I want to talk specifically about what I think some of those are, and specifically where a funder that is not in a position to give $4.5 billion can kind of make a concrete difference in this process. So the good news, it's not hopeless how funders can help. And I'll say that I have to fit this into 5 minutes, so the ideas might seem a bit broad, but I would be more than happy / privileged to talk to anyone individually about kind of specifics around this, how I see them being implemented. And a lot of these are actually things that my own organization is working on, so we are putting our money where my mouth is. So first off, in the field, I think it's really important to bolster and supplement UNHCR. We don't want to circumvent UNHCR. We don't want to recreate the wheel. We want to find ways that NGOs can kind of supplement the capacity of UNHCR, and I think there's some really specific ways that that can happen. First is funders should support NGOs in identifying refugees for protection and aid. So for all the reasons I outlined, outreach, home visits, sort of the legality of UNHCR playing a role in the registration process, UNHCR is prevented oftentimes from reaching a lot of the most vulnerable refugees, but many of them are working with NGOs. And there's a lot of room to build partnerships between UNHCR and NGOs for NGOs to flag those refugees to UNHCR. We've heard some pretty good inside information that a really, really large government aid package is about to come to UNHCR to the Middle East. And that aid package doesn't do any good if UNHCR isn't aware of the refugees who are most in need of the aid. And I think there's a really important role for NGOs to play there. Second is NGOs screening and referring refugees for resettlement. So UNHCR put out a report this week that they expect there to be 126,000 resettlement slots available this year. That's excluding asylum. So that's only people leaving sort of from their countries of first asylum to destination countries, but that their current staffing will only allow them to fill 56% of those slots, which means even in a world where the U.S. doesn't increase the number of refugees that it's willing to resettle, there's going to be something like 55,000 slots that could go to save people's lives that are going to go unfilled without supplementary assistance. And that's something that the NGO community can provide. I think that should take two forms. First is that there should be funding for capacity building and training of NGOs to flag and refer cases for resettlement to UNHCR and to identify cases that meet resettlement criteria. And second is that obviously there's some obstacles to this. If you're running a camp or a food program, maybe you don't have the capacity to do resettlement, maybe you don't know how to do the write-up appropriately, or maybe you don't want to be identified as participating in resettlement because you don't want to look like you're playing favorites amongst the different populations that you're serving. I think that there's a role for NGOs to play a bundling role in this. So for there to be like a key NGO in a country or a region of a country that can take referrals from other NGOs, package them up and write them up appropriately, and then submit them in bulk to UNHCR. Finally, on this front, I think NGOs can be training and seconding staff to UNHCR. There are a couple of really interesting existing models for this. That can be both to sort of bolster the capacity around registration and resettlement, to cut down interview wait times, but also to improve coordination between different entities within UNHCR. So to make sure that the protection unit is talking to the resettlement unit about cases that maybe need both resettlement and protection. The two other things that are separate from UNHCR in the field are first, folding refugees into broader development efforts. So if you're already funding a microfinance group or a school or a hospital in Afghanistan, you could provide designated funding to make sure that internally displaced people and refugees and stateless persons are served by those institutions rather than having to kind of reinvent a parallel system of institutions for refugees. And finally, supporting specialty grassroots organizations, in particular organizations reaching out to stateless people, LGBTI, and women's shelters. For funders who can fund in the United States, I think supporting advocacy with the U.S. government is the really important role. One thing I want to get across is that refugees are immigrants. They are processed under the Immigration and Nationality Act by the same agencies that admit immigrants. So immigration advocacy really ought to encompass refugees. There's been some talk, the U.S. is only taking 10,000 people. I clearly agree that we should be taking a lot more people, but I do think that funding around U.S. resettlement has a pretty enormous ripple effect for 3 reasons. First is that the U.S. is the global resettlement leader. We take more resettled refugees than any other country combined. And as such, we're really setting the tone for other destination countries who look to what we're doing and feel like it's appropriate for the U.S. to do part of the burden sharing. The second is that there's a lot of really interesting ways that U.S. resettlement can be leveraged politically to improve the treatment of refugees who are still in countries of first asylum. So frequently there will be these backdoor negotiations where Jordan will say, we're closing our door to Syrian refugees, but we'll let in 100,000 more if the U.S. promises to take 5,000 of them. Or will better respect the rights of women refugees and agree not to deport them for being trafficked if the U.S. takes in X number. So I think with thoughtful advocacy, there's quite a bit of room to leverage U.S. resettlement to improve conditions of refugees in countries of first asylum. And the third is the national security implications. The projection of the U.S. into the Middle East cannot only be militaristic. To date, we have dropped more bombs on Syria than we have admitted Syrian refugees, and this is not lost on the countries in the region. And I think for our own kind of geopolitical projection into the Middle East and our own national security, it's really important that we be seen as a leader on the humanitarian side of this issue as well. Finally, obviously, there's a big difference between the number pledged and the number admitted. We need to be making sure that the U.S. is actually implementing background checks in an expeditious manner. There's definitely room to fund advocacy around that. And lastly, the United States is UNHCR's biggest funder, which really gives them unparalleled influence over what UNHCR is doing. So advocating with the U.S. can make a big difference with UNHCR. So in sum, for U.S.-focused funders, more advocacy around specific policies and policy initiatives as regards refugee processing, the support of the direct referrals of refugees to the U.S. by NGOs, which can bypass UNHCR, supporting advocacy with the U.S. to widen the role played by NGOs in the UNHCR process, and supporting advocacy within the United States to improve the background check process. So thank you so much to GSER for having me, to my fellow presenters. There's a lot to do, but also a lot that can be done.
Great. Thank you so much, Becca, for squeezing in so much rich information in a short span of time. We do have a bunch of questions that I think are both for you and for Bill to weigh in on. And my colleague Camelia is going to go through the list of questions.
Sure. So the first question comes from Celine, and she says, you mentioned the question of why now, but I didn't hear a direct explanation as the conflict in Syria has been going on since 2011. What has happened or changed that it has now come to the media's attention in a significant manner? So that's the first question. We have 2 more after that.
My impression just from talking to our clients, and Bill mentioned this a bit too, I think most Syrians didn't want to flee. And they didn't want to be resettled. They fled to neighboring countries, but when we would speak to them, mostly they wanted to go back home. And it broke down a little bit, I think, along class lines in certain ways and along literacy lines. But I think at this point it's sort of so protracted that people are kind of giving up. And we increasingly have clients coming to us and saying that maybe they should get smuggled. And my impression is just that people who initially were trying to wait it out, either in Syria or in neighboring countries, don't see a chance to go back home anytime soon, and so they're looking abroad. I think that's a huge part of it. And then the second piece is, communication back. So I mentioned that when Adnan reached out to us, he said, I got flowers and chocolate. I'm going to tell all my friends to do this. And that's really common. We've never had a client without a cell phone. And we've had some pretty disenfranchised and destitute clients. I think the refugee community is in touch with each other, and success stories get around. And even if successes aren't that common, I think when you're at the bottom of a really big hole, you need to believe that there's a light at the top. So if you hear like one person made it to Germany, that makes you start thinking, maybe I should do that. So I think it also has a snowball effect.
Fantastic. And Bill, did you want to weigh in on that question at all, or shall we move to the next one?
Well, there are two parts to it. One is the countries of origin, and I think we have touched on that, the sense that people have held on for as long as they can. But and I've talked to people just that have fled very recently. They're coming from government-controlled areas now, which is something new. I mean, in the last years that I've been in the region, everyone's come from the sort of the rebel areas, and now they're coming from government-controlled areas, and they're also coming, of course, from ISIS controlled areas too. So there are new drivers afoot, and people that had not previously left. And then I think the second part of it is, why don't they stay in the countries of first asylum? And I think Becca and I both have alluded to that. But I think there are some recent precipitating factors. One in Turkey, in particular, being that Turkey has announced, just this summer, that they're intent on creating a quote-unquote safe zone in northern Syria. The U.S. is supposed to be teaming up with them, but the U.S. has said it would not be a no-fly zone, which means that barrel bombs would still be dropping there from Assad's helicopters. And I think there's a fear among refugees that are in Turkey that they're hearing high Turkish government officials saying that it's going to be time soon for 1.9 million refugees to be going back. So I think that there are a combination of factors. A lot of the refugees that I spoke to were also of Kurdish background, and the situation between the Kurds and the Turkish government has gotten really, really bad this year. There have been warnings of a new outbreak of civil war, basically in Turkey itself, and so I think the Kurdish Syrians are moving on. I think Sunni Arab ones are moving on in ways that they hadn't previously because of the fear of the prospect of the safe area. And I think there's a new element of maybe some of the other minorities that have been more associated with the regime coming out, some of them coming directly, but not wanting to be in the population of people where they may feel that they're under suspicion because they're coming from government-controlled areas, and where they feel finally that that the ship is sinking in Syria, and they really think that they may not have any chance and any prospect to go back home, and so they are looking ahead. And then just the other thing is that the lack of educational opportunities. A lot of people are saying, I don't care about myself, but it's for my children. And they really don't see educational opportunities, particularly in Turkey where they don't speak the language. They're much more inclined to actually learn German, or they speak English already, and to go to Europe for education for their children, as opposed to trying to struggle in refugee camps and in slums in Turkey.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill.
So we have a funder who was going to share briefly what her foundation's doing within the U.S., Leslie Gross Davis of the Open Society Foundations, and who has to get off shortly. And I wonder if we could unmute her quickly so that she can share her thoughts before having to make her next meeting.
Hi, am I unmuted?
Yes. Perfect.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thanks, and this has been wonderful so far. Just briefly, and this actually follows up on a lot of Becca's comments. Right now, we are domestically helping to underwrite and mobilize a bit of a public push by mayors in support of raising the refugee camp and in support of resettlement assistance. In addition, we've been doing some behind-the-scenes reaching out to national civil rights groups and immigrant rights groups to publicly express their support for these efforts. We're also organizing public support from some non-traditional allies in the political spectrum. We really anticipate there being an uptick in bogus national security strawman arguments, so we're going to try to mobilize folks to go on the offensive there. Lastly, and this is where I'd love in the days that follow to hear more from everyone on this call, we're really trying to assess the appetite and capacity for a larger short-term grassroots mobilization campaign that would target the administration, the Hill, and conservative critics on all the items that have been discussed so far.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie. And your colleagues from Open Society Foundations, Maria Teresa Rojas and Ivy's also on the line. So thank you for sharing briefly before you have to go, and then we'll be sure to loop back with you on your request to the group. So we do have a couple more questions, which I think, given time, maybe we will move forward, since we just moved the slide, to provide a quick snapshot. Maria Teresa is going to give her perspective based on what OSF is doing, but I wanted to briefly give you all maybe a few minutes overview of what the philanthropic response to date has been based on informal research we at GSER had conducted over the summer months. It's by no means a comprehensive study, but we hope it gives you a feel for some of what your funding colleagues are doing around the world, and primarily in the space of the Middle Eastern refugee crisis and the flight to Europe. So, as has been mentioned, the refugee crisis has been escalating over the past few years, and what we learned in talking with a number of foundations and NGOs is that the philanthropic response up until recent months has been very limited. Whoops. I'm not sure who's doing the slides here. Okay. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of what that has looked like. The longer-term funders have really focused on humanitarian relief. Corporate funders like UPS, family foundations like the Conrad Hilton Foundation have been at the forefront of supporting humanitarian relief efforts in the adjacent countries, as well as in some of in Greece, et cetera. IKEA, I don't know if you all know, but is the single largest private donor to the UNHCR, so very active in this space. And the bulk of funding has been in humanitarian relief, given the great need and the limited resources that governments have allocated to it. But funders such as Open Society Foundations for the Euro-Mediterranean Foundation have also supported human rights advocacy, peace-building efforts, and policy advocacy to protect the social and economic rights of refugees. So that's, as Bill had said earlier, his program has 2 people. So funding in that particular space is far smaller than the humanitarian relief space. And the mass migration in recent months has really caught not just the media's attention, but also that of philanthropy as well. So in the past couple of weeks, we've seen, more people coming into the fold. I realized I just forgot to mention something. On the individual donor front, going back to the previous slide, the founder and CEO of Chobani Yogurt, who last year made a $2 million gift to aid Iraqis and Syrians in Turkey, in May of this year committed $700 million to help refugees across the globe, largely through public awareness and direct relief efforts. So, but other than his commitment, the number of funders in the space and the scale of support has been pretty modest. Now, fast forward to a couple weeks, within the past couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of corporations in their giving programs making 7-figure grants, all for humanitarian relief. They're listed here on the slide. And then we also are seeing companies really trying to leverage individual donations, with Google, TripAdvisor, and the Canadian government for its nationals trying to have matching programs, one-to-one matching programs going. And there's also efforts to coordinate within philanthropy. Funders in Europe are coordinating efforts at the EU level as well as the national levels. You've got the Ariadne Network, which is a network of European funders focused on social change and human rights. They've put together, set up an online portal to share information and resources, and they're hosting biweekly teleconferences to promote funder coordination. Maria Teresa may talk about EPIM in a little bit, but it's an initiative of a dozen or so European foundations, and one of the areas that they had talked about focusing on was the integration of unaccompanied minors, and that may expand, given the situation currently. And there's the Joint Fund for Hungarian Civil Society, which is a collaboration of funders in Europe and the U.S., and it's seeking to fund volunteer-based efforts in Hungary, where the government has not been keen on receiving refugees. And then finally, the Center on Disaster Philanthropy has set up a refugee crisis fund, and it includes many of the U.S.-based NGOs, likely will be, recipients of funding. But what's great about that for, local funders is that the center staff will do all the due diligence and help and inform the grant-making decisions. So you can check out their website. Wanted to flag very quickly that the European Foundation Center is conducting a survey of its members, and others can contribute, can weigh in as well. They launched the survey in response to the crisis, and they're really framing this issue not as an emergency situation, but the new normal for Europe. In fact, an NGO that we talked to working at the EU level has called this a permanent crisis. And an EU funder puts it this way, that they need to really support efforts to help refugees not only cope in the immediate term, but adapt and integrate in the longer term as well. So given that, beyond the humanitarian crisis and relief efforts, funders and NGOs that we talked to really saw a critical need to support mid and longer range efforts. So while in the camps, education for children, many have said, is really, really critical, as are language and workforce training programs for the adults. Policy advocacy has been mentioned, public awareness. There's a question about communications that hopefully the speakers will address. But, to increase understanding about the plight of refugees, sustain the goodwill that has been shown in recent weeks, but also to head off anti-refugee, anti-Muslim backlash and other tensions that may emerge given the scale of the issue. And, of course, resettlement. We also talked with funders in the Middle East and as well as in Europe, and really, Bill has said this, Becca as well, that funding efforts in under-resourced countries really, really critical. Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, et cetera. Lebanon, for example, a very small country, which now the population is 1 in 4 Syrians now. So they definitely need resources. And thinking long term, it's really critical to help refugees. What one of the funders we talked to had said, imagine the future. Education programs are vital in this aspect, and as it's supporting integrated strategies, of course you want to meet the basic needs like health and education, but integrating arts programming into the effort has shown significant promise to help people get out of that crisis mode and think about where they might be in the future. And again, the public communications campaign, helping cities become more welcoming was mentioned specifically, and this was not a U.S.-based funder, and also financing broader campaigns. So to Leslie's point at OSF, the city campaign seems to be something that others in Europe are thinking about as well as in countries of first asylum. So that's just a quick overview. We'll pause for any questions. If you'll just you do a quick evaluation, that would be great. And then I want to turn it over to Maria Teresa to share the work of OSF and her thoughts on funding priorities. So we'll do that, and then hopefully get to more discussion. So Maria Teresa, turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Darren. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. But maybe speak up slightly louder.
Okay. So I think I've been trying to make sure that I have maybe a few new pieces to add, but it is I'm coming at the end of excellent, very excellent detailed presentations. So let me see. Let me start by saying, first of all, that by no means is our work that I'm going to refer to does it stand on its own. It simply is a sampling of the type of things we've been doing, and I'll try to emphasize perhaps a few pieces that have not been mentioned. But I'll start simply by saying that for us, there are three dimensions of the refugee crisis in Europe that stand out in particular. Certainly the human suffering. That's number one. Next is the political polarization of the situation. It is very political, and there is a lot of divide that is of great concern to us. And third is the existential questions about the essence of the European Union itself, since we think that core European values and institutions are at risk. That's how grave we see the situation. So my remarks are somewhat more focused on Europe, but I think towards the end I have a couple of ideas, suggestions of things that we all can be investing in. Many parts of OSF have been intensely engaged on all of these three fronts that I mentioned: the human suffering, the political aspects, and the existential questions about the European Union and what all this means, not only to the Union but to the international refugee protection system. It'd be safe to say that I have four categories of work in which we've been doing work. One is a policy generating initiative. The next level is a very intense political advocacy mechanism that we set up. And third is trying to generate more coordination among civil society organizations, facilitating their work at the national level and connecting that to EU advocacy. And finally, which is something more exploratory at this point, is figuring out how to harness the public support that we've seen in recent weeks in Europe by nurturing the grassroots organizing that is spontaneously taking place. Our strategy at OSF is a combination of grant making, mainly to a variety of organizations at the grassroots level, but also well-established international organizations. But there's another aspect to our work, and that is support to advocacy, but more importantly, direct advocacy as well at various levels, but particularly very high-level advocacy. So, I believe all of you know that OSF has a long history of engagement in many parts of Europe, which gives us the capacity and the ability to do work in almost every country that is affected or is involved in this situation, whether it's in countries of origin, countries of transit, and certainly in destination in Europe. So we do have, that is at the core of what we do, which is trying to leverage that access. We have about 23 national foundations, and we operate really in about almost every country in the world. So that's another thing to keep in mind when I may be a little general in these comments, but it is keeping in mind that we are able to execute a lot of our work, or also the work is fed by our presence on the ground. So in Hungary, in Hungary, Italy, Greece, and the Western Balkan countries, OSF, our foundation in Europe, which we call OSIFE, has been supporting organizations that provide medical and legal services for asylum seekers and migrants. Certainly that type of work does not make a distinction between those two categories. But we are also supporting the monitoring of human rights violations at the borders. Very, very relevant and important, particularly in the Hungarian border. But also monitoring and documenting human rights violations in processing camps. Again, all possible through our local presence. But here's another interesting kind of new, a little bit different take on our response, on what we call a humanitarian response. It's not your traditional humanitarian response, but it is categorized there. And that is that we're helping NGOs access funding for frontline efforts on humanitarian work. And we're doing that through our national foundations in Kosovo, in Macedonia, and in Serbia. We feel that it is incredibly important to not only provide the funding, but to help these organizations create and reinforce their own administrative and fundraising capacity. In Italy and the Balkans, the donors funding for migration issues, whether it's government or non-government funding, is really scarce. And it is in these countries, as we've been hearing, where civil society is the only set of actors responding to the desperate needs of migrants and asylum seekers. So building their fundraising capacity and building and leveraging funding at the local level, we see this as a critical moment to unlock more funding, and we put our strength behind this effort so that these organizations can have long-term impact, as many people, as our other speakers have mentioned, that it is extremely important to do. But here I'd also now like to turn to the other aspect that I alluded to earlier about OSF's work. We have been engaging in direct advocacy. We have been pursuing a high-level political advocacy strategy in Europe, and in more recent weeks here in the United States, because we recognize that it is not only about having the best policy ideas, but it's very much a political battle. And I think I learned that, certainly, and I think all of you will identify with this from the United States, that this is one of the lessons we learned years ago in our U.S. immigration reform efforts, that we have to be very much reacting to the political realities of these situations. It is not sufficient to have good ideas. However, on the good ideas, on the policy ideas, I have to say that I'm proud to say that my program, the International Migration Initiative, saw this coming when others were reluctant to even consider thinking about any possible reforms to the European asylum system. So back in 2013, we experimented with a very low-key project to bring together policymakers of various levels behind closed doors almost, so that they would feel comfortable speaking and contributing. And we created a safe space for them to come up with, to start exploring various aspects of the asylum system in Europe, and then helping them recognize which aspects needed reform, and generating ideas on how to reform those. Our belief, motivating this, is that we felt that the European asylum system could jeopardize the Schengen system of free movement, and even the European Union itself. That's that fundamental of an issue, we felt. many of the ideas that we started to generate and refine with about over 2 years with about 20 member states and civil society. We were debating them when this crisis really took to such a different level that I have to admit that many of the ideas were still being debated internally, and that's why we also have seen some resistance to them, because in a way they were half cooked. And we had thought that this will be, in fact, we called this project European Asylum 2020, because we thought that was a horizon for creating change, and now we had to accelerated to just a few months. And so that work needs to be continued. We're reaching out to new audiences. Decisions about this are being made not only by interior ministers, but by foreign ministers and prime ministers. So our strategy has to change greatly. Let me switch over outside of Europe to the Middle East and North Africa. There's a crisis action coalition on Syria. Most of the main humanitarian and rights NGOs, which is composed of those humanitarian and NGOs, they're calling for a radical scaling up of assistance to Syrian neighbors, calling for somewhat of a Marshall Plan for the region. That is something of great interest to us. We've been talking about a Marshall Plan for the region informally in informal halls, and we think that the time may have come for something like this. So that's another type of work we're moving. We're also looking at advocacy in the General Assembly coming up, and at the G20 as targets for ideas such as the Marshall Plan for the region. Now let me conclude with four little ideas. First, not just for OSF, but all of us on this call, I think it is important to support individuals and small groups and local communities that are providing the crucial moral and operational leadership. Efforts such as Refugee Welcome, which is that platform by Airbnb. That type of innovation is the type of things that we need to see more of, and we should all be supporting. There's another one called MOAS. Some of you on the call may know. But it's a private effort to rescue people at sea, and they were there before even the European Union was, in terms of rescuing people, putting a ship at their disposal, and other things such as Refugee Air, etc. These are the type of efforts that we believe that are changing the political conversations, and they actually are pioneering the type of systems that allowed for local communities and people to become engaged, directly supporting refugees, in addition to the things we've heard on the call so far. And I think these are the type of things that will increase the odds that integration will succeed. These are still all very much at small scale, but more of these private sponsorship ideas would be great. Second, if any of you are able to do support advocacy, sustained political advocacy could be pivotal, but now in specific countries. I think we need to take our advocacy in Europe to specific countries like Poland and Spain, where there's still significant opposition to the European Union's ideas. Because after all, it is at the country level, regardless of the concept of of the common European asylum system. There's actually 28 separate systems. The advocacy is needed to resist the hardening of migration and asylum laws that is starting to happen in so many countries. One note on civil society in Europe. I think that I'm not. I can feel comfortable to say that civil society is working in many levels, but as a whole, it is still somewhat weak. Groups are split between NGOs that are focusing on asylum seekers and those that are also supporting economic migrants. A lot of discussion about those two, that separation, which we all can contribute to creating the space and the ability to discuss that one aspect. But I think it was we saw very limited ability to mobilize or limited mobilizing power of civil society, as we were not able to capitalize on the efforts such as We Apologize Twitter campaign or the Welcome Refugees initiatives by ordinary citizens, universities, and others. And I think that those are the type of things that we need to be able to do a lot more. One thing that we haven't discussed on this call too much, it has been the one other crisis that was.
Oh, so
yes,
sorry. We are out of time, and I wanted to.
No problem.
Yeah, so
absolutely.
I think there's a lot that we haven't discussed on this call for sure, and which is why it's a webinar series. So
no problem.
We definitely want to, get more information out to funders in the field, and endeavor to do so with future webinars. In fact, because we are out of time, it would be awesome if you can actually give a quick rating of the overall webinar. And then the next question is even more crucial. And we'll send, I think, Camille, will we send a link?
Yes, we'll be sending a link to our resource page, and we'll also be sending you all a copy of the PowerPoint. So stay tuned.
Great, great. And we want to learn from you all what else you want to hear about. And hopefully this has interested you enough to, continue to explore the issue more. And Maria Teresa, I think if it's okay with you as well as Becca and Bill, we can share your contact information with the group in case they would like to get more information from you. And one question that we'd love to, if there are still folks on the call, which there are actually, how likely is your foundation to make grants and respond to the refugee crisis, with 5 being very likely? It would be immensely helpful for us to know, if you're listening in because of personal interest in the issue, or if your foundation is actually going to consider funding, and that will help inform our follow-up as well. We will we'll make the PowerPoint available and any other resources. There's a resource page on the GSER website. But since we are over time, I really want to thank Bill Frelick from Human Rights Watch, Becca Heller from the International Refugee Assistance Project, Maria Teresa Rojas from the Open Society Foundation's International Migration Initiative for sharing your time and expertise, and to all of you for being on this call. We'll have the recording available as well should you have colleagues who weren't able to be on this call. Thank you all very much, co-sponsors, et cetera. Team GSER, have a wonderful rest of your day.